Hello, everyone. It's great to have you again joining us today for another event of the newly established Center for Constitutions in Context here at Warwick Law School. I'm David Vitale, an associate professor here at Warwick Law School, and again, one of the co-directors of the Center for Constitutions in Context. As always, I'm joined by my colleague and co-director, Mara Malagodi, as well as, of course, our esteemed speakers for today's event. So today we have a new research seminar focusing on the work by Professor Mike Powell from the University of Ottawa, dealing specifically with the discussion of the topic of Fourth Branch Constitutionalism. So with that kind of said, I'll turn things over to Mara for more fulsome introductions. So take it away, Mara.
Good afternoon, everyone from Warwick Law School. My name is Mara Malagodi. I am a reader here. I'm the co-director of the CCC, and I will chair the event today. It is with great pleasure that I introduce the speakers for today's event. Our presenter is Professor Mike Powell, who is full professor in the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. Mike researches primarily the law of democracy, comparative constitutional law, and electoral law. He is the author of over 30 academic articles and is currently working on a book manuscript on the comparative constitutional law and politics of election commissions. He is the co-editor of Cyber Threats to Canadian Democracy with McGill's Queens, published in 2022, which is the first book on election cybersecurity in Canada, and which was named one of the Hill Times Political Books of the Year. Our first commentator is Professor Tarun Khaitan, who is the Professor Chair for Public Law at the LSE Law School and an Honorary Professorial Fellow at Melbourne Law School. His primary research interests are comparative public law, legal theory, and discrimination law. He is currently working on a monograph on constitutional design and is the author of the monograph The Theory of Discrimination Law with Oxford University Press, published in 2015, alongside many articles in leading law journals. Their own research has been cited in over a dozen of cases by influential courts, including the Indian Supreme Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, and many, many others. Our second commentator is Dr Ming-Sung Kuo, who is reader associate professor with us here at Warwick Law School. His research interests are in the fields of constitutional and legal theory, comparative constitutional law, and public international law. Ming-Sung publications have appeared in leading law journals, and he was the winner of the 2020 Icon Best Paper Prize. Over to David for some housekeeping.
Okay, thanks, Mara. So in terms of format, so Mike will speak for, I think, somewhere between 25 or so minutes. After that, we'll have Tarun and Ming-Sung to offer their remarks, which Mike will be able to respond to. And as always, we've left some time for audience questions. And as always with our events, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please pop them into the Q&A section of Teams, and we'll do our best to collate and convey them to Mike or our commentators, and well, as many as time, of course, allows. So yeah, back to Mara.
Over to Mike for his paper on Fourth Branch Constitutionalism.
Thank you very much to Mara and to David for the kind invitation. It's my first time here in Warwick. It's a delight to be here in the early days of the center. And my thanks to Ming-Sung and Tarun for their comments. Really looking forward to continuing the discussions I've had with both of you over the last little while on this topic. And so paper today is on Fourth Branch Constitutionalism. Just to give you a bit of the how it relates to some of my other work, I am working on a book on election commissions, which are one of the main case studies in the Fourth Branch, and then also editing a handbook on the Fourth Branch. So this kind of grows out of those two projects. And so the paper that the presentation is based on starts out by covering a bit of the ground of the last 10 years of scholarship, where the Fourth Branch has become kind of one of the main focuses of comparative constitutional law scholarship. And so this paper is an attempt to kind of move beyond the initial, very important debates that we've had, and a number of us in the room and online have been part of, to try to chart a little bit of a new path. So scholarship has been focused on questions like, is there conceptual utility in calling it a fourth branch at all? Okay. If so, how many branches are there? Are there more than 4? Okay, which institutions might make up the branches? Okay, and important questions of that nature. So I don't try to give those short coverage at all, but to recognize those important debates, but try to explain what the practice of the fourth branch has been like writ large globally. And so the argument in the paper is really that there is something, a set of practices that we can call fourth branch constitutionalism. Okay. And so for the talk today, I'm going to first say something a little bit about what is constitutionalism. Okay. Much contested and written about topic. Then a little bit more about what is the fourth branch. Okay, and then I'm going to make a claim that there's 3 defining features of fourth branch constitutionalism. The first is that it embodies what we can call the positive dimension of constitutionalism, not just constitutionalism as restraint, but as empowering public institutions. Okay. Secondly, that the fourth branch and fourth branch constitutionalism relies on a form of non-electoral legitimacy, okay, which deserves some explanation and is a difficult kind of legitimacy to possess in a kind of populist moment. Okay. And thirdly, and I think maybe the most provocatively, I want to argue that fourth branch constitutionalism has not been as transformative in nature as it is sometimes assumed to be, and we should best understand it as actually having quite liberal constitutionalist outcomes and structure. Okay, so those are the 3 main claims within the broader argument that there's something called fourth branch constitutionalism that we should take seriously. Okay, so what is constitutionalism? Okay, often used term, not always defined. Just in the last week, I've been listening to seminars on environmental constitutionalism, okay, and so and a whole host of other different kinds of constitutionalism. So it's not the main claim I want to make today, but I would side with those who say that constitutionalism, whatever the ambiguities that we need to clarify, is still a relevant and important concept. Okay, I know Martin Laughlin and others kind of want to set it aside. I still think it's useful as we try to understand what is happening in the world of constitutions. Okay, and so the standard or orthodox view of constitutionalism is that it's a practice of compliance with constitutional rules and principles, primarily in the service of restraining public power or state power. Okay, and sort of in the abstract, we can understand this as part of post-World War II constitutionalism, okay, where written constitutions, bills of rights, and judicial review were part of the package of constitutional reform. So in that historical milieu, this is a very good quote I like from Will Wallachau, Canadian legal theorist, who says that constitutionalism is, quote, the idea that government can and should be legally limited in its powers, and that its authority or legitimacy depends on its observing these limitations. Okay, so that is a very good, concise summary of what I think is the orthodox view of constitutionalism. So at the heart of that view is one of restraint, okay, that we need to constrain exercises of public authority. That only does capture one dimension of constitutional practice. Constitutions do, of course, empower, okay, and they assign authority and they fund. And so it's incorrect, I think, if we focus only on the side of constitutionalism that involves restraint, okay?
And so I'm happy to talk more about that, but Nick Barber calls it negative versus positive constitutionalism. And so I think he's correct in arguing we should make sure to pay attention to both dimensions of constitutionalism, the negative and the positive. And it's the positive part that'll be more relevant for the rest of the argument. So for our purposes, or my purposes today, the key aspect of constitutionalism is that it's a practice within political and legal orders that restrains but also empowers institutions at the same time. Okay, so the relevant aspects of constitutionalism very much in brief. Okay, so that's what is constitutionalism. What is the fourth branch then, as the next part of the argument? The traditional three branches will be very well understood by everyone: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Alongside the branches, there's always been private entities, corporations. There's always been informal power. There's always been supranational or transnational entities, treaties. Okay, the administrative state, obviously. So the three branches have never been sort of hermeneutically sealed off from, or hermetically sealed off, excuse me, from other types of power. Okay, but something changed after World War II, and especially after the expansion of democracy around 1989, 1991, sometimes called the third wave. And so many scholars, me included, have tried to argue that there is something in constitutional design and practice where some new institutions deserve the title and the status of a fourth branch, because that was the intent of constitutional designers, if not always how they've operated in practice. And so these public institutions tend to be empowered by the written constitution, okay, independent from the traditional branches, formally as a matter of law, and not always, but often nonpartisan or impartial, often as a matter of law. And the classic case studies are, of course, the South African Chapter 9 institutions, where there is a list in Chapter 9 of the South African post-apartheid constitution of independent constitutional bodies to protect democracy. Election Commission of India, also another of the main case studies, often identified as an independent constitutional branch. Okay, and so the phenomenon is much broader in scope than only South Africa and India. It's important to note. There's older intellectual roots about the ideas of independent institutions, and I'll talk a bit more about Kelsen and his views later on in the presentation. But I think they should be situated, these new independent bodies, alongside the very well recognized growth in independent constitutional courts as part of the kind of standard package of constitutionalism with the third wave of democracy. Also worth noting, very importantly, the fourth branch, I'm situated in Canada, in the UK right now, but situated in Canada where I work generally. The fourth branch is not a phenomenon of the traditional Westminster democracies, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. It's not something that we would necessarily identify with the US Constitution. It really is, for lack of a better term, a phenomenon or innovation, contribution of Global South constitutionalism. So Africa, Asia, Latin America, okay, as the case studies where we can, the jurisdictions where that are most relevant in trying to theorize about the fourth branch and fourth branch constitutionalism. Okay, so the two most common fourth branch bodies, okay, and this is where I initially came to study the topic, are election commissions. Okay, very logical, right? If you have a new democracy and you want to lock it in, it might make sense to empower an independent institution to administer the election. Okay. The second one may be less intuitive, which is central banks. Okay, now you can understand that the role of central banks is independent monetary policy, okay, away from the pressures that politicians have to turn on the money supply in the lead up to an election. Okay. Maybe less clear if that's essential to preserve constitutional democracy or if that's a political choice. So I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Human rights commissions, ombuds persons, gender equality commissions are also common, but there's a host of institutions globally. Okay, and so one of the features that you have to, I would argue we need to recognize about the Fourth Branch, even though there is conceptual utility in the concept, but there's a lot of variation. Okay, it has to be acknowledged. There's variation cross-nationally across jurisdictions. Okay, in terms of which institutions make up the Fourth Branch. There's regional variation. Latin America has hybrid electoral commission courts, which are relatively unique, not used elsewhere. And there's actually quite a lot of variation over time within the same jurisdiction, right? As the push and pull of politics changes how the branches operate. Okay, and so we can get into this more in the Q&A or in the comments if you want. There are a bunch of arguments against the Fourth Branch concept. Okay, one is that there is so much variation. How can we actually identify this as a common phenomenon or a single concept? Okay, and my answer to that is usually, while acknowledging, of course, the variation, is that same argument applies to the executive, right? How it works in a presidential system, very different than how it works in a parliamentary system. But we still say there's something called the executive, right? Judicial branch works very differently in one jurisdiction than another. So a lot of variation, but the trend line is clear. Something did change in constitutional design after World War II, and especially after 1989. The majority of countries in the world, for example, do now have constitutionally protected election commissions operating independent from the other branches, at least formally, if not always in practice. Okay, so a bit about what is constitutionalism, a bit about the Fourth Branch. Now, what are the defining features of Fourth Branch constitutionalism? Okay, and the first one is that it clearly reflects the idea of constitutionalism as restraint, but Fourth Branch constitutionalism is often about the positive dimension of constitutionalism as well. So take election commissions. They do restrain the public service or parliament or the executive, depending on who had control over elections before, right? They put a limit on their power and replace them as the public body exercising discretion to administer the election. But they also have to be empowered, usually by the Constitution. They have to be funded. There has to be an appointments process. They have to be given a certain grant of legal authority. And all of that is very hard to square with an idea of constitutionalism only about restraint. Okay, it's about empowering often new bodies, sometimes to entrench a particular view of constitutional democracy, sometimes as an act of nation building, right? You can especially imagine a post-colonial context. And so funding, jurisdiction, legal authority, sometimes the requirement to report to the traditional branches, but denying the traditional branches a veto. All these can be seen through the lens of the positive dimension of constitutionalism. Okay. One of the interesting facts about election commissions is national constitutions often try to give them a formal constitutional status. How do you do that? There's a variety of ways, one of which is to tag along with one of the existing branches. Okay, Indian Constitution says the Chief Electoral Commissioner shall have a status similar to Supreme Court judges, for example. There's lots more to be said about that. There's a lot of litigation and case law in India, but another example of empowering the new institutions. Okay, so that's the first point about the positive dimension of constitutionalism is part and parcel with Fourth Branch constitutionalism. The second main argument is that Fourth Branch institutions rely on a form of non-electoral legitimacy. Okay, and to be independent and nonpartisan means they are not elected. Okay, and they are deliberately cut off from being controlled by those individuals or entities that are directly authorized by voters at election time. And so as a result, their legitimacy has often been contested from a variety of different sources, academic and sort of on-the-ground politics. In Mexico, over the last couple of years, the former president and the new president put in their targeting sites, the Fourth Branch bodies, along with courts. Okay, and the argument was, why are unelected public servants exercising so much power against the will of the people? Why are they being paid so much? Why are they acting as if they are equals? You could kind of read between the lines, okay, as part of a kind of left populist approach to constitutional reform. So they're not elected, therefore they're illegitimate, was kind of at the heart of the political critique in Mexico of the Election Commission and other independent bodies. Political constitutionalists are quite skeptical of the Fourth Branch, and everyone will be very familiar with Waldronian arguments against courts as independent arbiters. The same kinds of arguments can be deployed against the Fourth Branch. Why are independent bodies making decisions that should be within the domain of electoral politics and elected representatives? There is also, importantly, a lot of political theory and political science work that is trying to resuscitate and defend the idea of political parties and partisanship. Okay, and so James Madison famously wrote skeptically about factions, right? They would distort our ability to achieve the public interests because they would be seeking to fulfill private interests. Okay, and so Leah Yippee and Stephen White, Nancy Rosenblum, and a number of other scholars have tried to say in reaction to that, democracy can't function without parties, and we should actually defend the role of partisanship and defend the role of political parties, not as corrupting agents, but as necessary in a democracy. Okay, and so those are a bunch of different theories, but the common link between them is in defending partisanship, they don't actually provide a way for us to draw a line about where partisanship is properly found within the situated within the constitutional order and where it's improper. Okay, so partisanship's a good thing in the legislature and in the executive. Why is it not a good thing for an independent election commission, for example? Okay, and so I agree with those scholars that certainly partisanship is an indispensable part of democracy as it's practiced at the moment. Okay, but there still is room for non-electoral institutions. Okay, that's kind of the intuition behind the Fourth Branch bodies. And so I think Kelson most directly gives us a way to think about what the limits on partisanship should be. So not his work on legal theory, but he's got his little skinny volume on the essence and value of democracy. Okay, and Kelson argued in that book and elsewhere that nonpartisan administration is essential for democracy to function, because otherwise partisanship swallows up all the other institutions that exist. And so it's absolutely necessary within the legislature and the executive, the political executive, so as to resolve conflict and to be representative. But we need to preserve other institutions that can be nonpartisan. And he had the public service and constitutional courts obviously in mind, but we can sort of read in the independence of Fourth Branch institutions as well. Kelson also argues that in assessing the legitimacy of a constitutional order as a whole, we can't simply look at every institution and say, that's elected, it's legitimate, this one's unelected, so it's not legitimate. We should look at the mix of institutions together. And so seen through that kind of Kelsenian framework, the Fourth Branch, independent, nonpartisan entities can be a legitimate part of the constitutional order. And that insight is at the heart of the idea of Fourth Branch constitutionalism. Okay. Third and last of the main arguments I want to make is that these institutions, in the way that constitutionalism has actually been practiced, should be understood as having had primarily a liberal rather than a transformative effect. So I'm not saying that they could not be, in theory, transformational. I'm not saying that designers of constitutions didn't have transformational aspirations. Obviously, they have in some contexts, but they've been primarily bodies of liberal accountability and liberal constitutionalism. And so transformative constitutionalism comes out of scholars like Carl Clare and Dennis Davis's reading of the 1996 post-apartheid South African constitution as being intended to implement a post-liberal social and economic egalitarian transformation. Okay, and they've written skeptically about whether that was achieved or not in South Africa. But the concept of transformative constitutionalism has spread quite far globally. Courts and scholars have identified it as being tied to India, Colombia, and a whole host of African, Asian, and Latin American constitutions. And so there is an overlap between many of the central cases on the Fourth Branch with central cases in transformative constitutionalism. So naturally, there's been writing about the Fourth Branch as being transformative. Okay. I think the best way to understand the way that Fourth Branch Constitution is actually operated, though, is that it has not really led to transformative outcomes. Take central banks as an example, controlling the money supply, keeping interest rates low. Okay. Maybe that's changed the economy from what it was prior to its constitutional protection, but hard to see that as egalitarian social and economic transformation. Election commissions, similarly, moving from not being a democracy to being a democracy, that's obviously an important transformation, and election commissions are part of that. But the idea that they brought about social and economic egalitarianism is, I think, a harder claim to make. And so I don't have so much time left, but the paper goes into the ideas of the main drafter of the Indian Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, who had transformational aspirations in some of his constitutional and political theory, ending oppression on the basis of caste and religion and colonialism. Okay, so he was quite transformative in many of his broader views. In terms of constitutional design, he is on the record in the Constituent Assembly debates defending the idea of a national election commission, but really as a counter-majoritarian institution, preventing dominant parties from capturing the democracy, but also preventing local majorities in the states from oppressing minorities. So those are important aims, but I think best understood as primarily liberal ones rather than transformative in the full sense as discussed by Clare and Davis and many of the South African justices in the early days of the post-apartheid constitution. Okay, so just to conclude, looking forward to the comments and the discussion. Fourth Branch Constitutionalism shows that the negative but also the positive dimension of constitutionalism, relies on a theory of non-electoral legitimacy that I think hasn't quite been as robustly defended or articulated maybe as it needs to be to explain what is happening, and then has primarily been a liberal rather than a transformative constitutional set of practices. So very much looking forward to the comments and the discussion. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. May I turn things over to Tarun for his comments?
Thanks very much, Mara and David, for inviting me, and to Mike for writing this fantastic paper. I hope you can all hear me. Mike and I have been talking about this for a long time. My own work on the topic is broadly in two papers, which I'm just linking in the chat box. One of them, Mike, you do mention. The second one has just come out, which I'll send to you, which is in Jeff King's edited collection, and I'm going to rely a lot on that work to mostly build upon your second and your third feature. I'm not going to say very much about the first feature of positive constitutionalism, because that I just think is so obviously true. I think all constitutions do, I mean, almost all constitutions do positive and negative things, or impose positive and negative norms, although I don't find that distinction particularly sophisticated. There are better ways to understanding it. But anyway, I take the, Nick Barber's point that constitutions are not just matters of restraint. I think it's so obviously true, and guarantors clearly, some of them enforce negative norms like anti-corruption watchdogs, which just say don't be corrupt, right? So they enforce probity. Others like electoral commissions clearly do positive stuff. So I think that's just so obviously true that I'm not going to say very much about that, but I do have other things to say about the other two. But before I move on, and of course you will expect me to engage with you very quick. I'm not going to deal with the label issue because, as you know, unlike you, I have sort of planted my flag on that question, right? And said, no, we need to move beyond the fourth branch label. And we have had this conversation, but for the benefit of those who are in the room, I think I will, if you'll permit me to just belabor the point, Mike, which is I think there are good reasons now to move beyond the placeholder label, the fourth category. Yes, the fourth, it is a placeholder, and it invites attention to the fact that these institutions sit outside the three traditional branches of the state. And that's important, if only to avoid, for example, the stupidity of the American Supreme Court in Sila Law LLC case, where it said, well, this office is clearly not the judicial office, not a legislative office, it must be the executive office. Like, hang on, no, there is a fourth option, right? So it's important to talk about the fourth branch, right? But I don't think that we need to stay on the fourth branch. So I was looking at your definition, right? You say fourth branch refers to independent constitutional institutions beyond the traditional three branches. And, as you know, my definition of guarantor institutions agrees exactly with that. It just adds another criteria, right? Which is a functional criterion. And so this is my first question, whether you disagree with this functional claim, right? My functional claim is that it's true that these institutions are constitutionally entrenched. It's also true that they sit outside the three branches. But the third claim is that their function is to protect a fragile constitutional norm. Right? And that norm could be free and fair elections. It could be probity. It could be rule of law. It could be any constitutional norm. Obviously, the norm has to have constitutional status, and it's fragile in the sense that the other three institutions, either jointly or severally, either cannot protect that norm because of capacity reasons, or have conflicts of interests, or for other reasons would not want to protect. We have reasons to worry that they may not want to protect that norm, like the fragility of the free and fair election norm, which the ruling party will always have an interest in breaching, and therefore hence its fragility, right? So this is my first question, right? Do you disagree with that functional claim that is the role of these institutions? Because if you don't, then I wonder why we still need to stick to the placeholder of fourth and not accept that these are guarantor institutions. So the first comment/question. And of course, there are other options, right? You might agree with my claim and still think the guarantor label is rubbish. And you might have other possibilities. But that debate I'm happy to have, right? I just think we need to move beyond the fourth. It's an important point because the placeholder holds back intellectual and doctrinal progress, right? It's once we name a concept that in functional terms that we can start thinking about how to develop it. I know this is early days. I know that, but early days only in scholarship, not in practice. Practice, depending on when you start counting, is 70 years old or at least 30 years old, right? So I think it's important to name things in order to develop our concepts and thicken them and make them more sophisticated. So I'm not just making an intellectual point here, but I mean, not that I have anything against intellectual points. The second worry I have is obviously about branches, right? That, and again, I've made this point to you, Mike, that I'm not sure that every constitution that has guarantor institutions has a guarantor branch. I think that sometimes these institutions constitute a branch, but sometimes they don't. And obviously, this is presuming some unarticulated assumptions about what constitutes a branch, right? When do we call a panoply of institutions a branch, right? But I think something like a network effect, a nested hierarchy, something a common purpose, common purpose, of course, guaranteeing constitutional norms, that exists, right? But the others, I'm not sure they always exist. In Sri Lanka, they probably are coming into existence because of the existence of an umbrella body, the meta guarantor in the Constitutional Council. So maybe Sri Lanka, they're emerging. There is a branch that's emerging. And anybody who does not know this, I will invite you to look at Dinesha Samararatne's fantastic work on the meta guarantor in Sri Lanka, the Constitutional Council, right? But I'm not sure South Africa has a branch. Right? The Chapter 9 institutions, as far as I can tell as an outsider, I don't think there's anything tying them together and so on, right? So I would reserve judgment on whether South Africa has a guarantor branch. I think they have guarantor institutions. Or maybe you might think that, there's a normative unity because of those principles in Chapter 9, which tie them together. So maybe they're branch-like or whatever, right? But anyway, I think it needs some conceptual thinking in it. And I would also refrain from using the label branch for these bodies. Okay, so the final two comments I have are about your last two features, and I'll start with the transformative because I have less to say there, and then I'll come to the legitimacy point, which I think is the most, I find the most interesting, and you're really pushing the scholarship on this topic further in thinking about that deeply, right? So it's interesting. I think in your presentation, it was a lot clearer that you weren't making a conceptual point, but a historical one, that these institutions have not historically been used for transformative purposes because it wasn't, this could be my reading, but it wasn't entirely clear in the paper. So I would clarify that you're not making a conceptual point that they cannot do transformation. So I think in theory, they could be transformative. But here was the thought, right? Why it's probably a bad idea to do transformation through these institutions. And that is that guarantor institutions, for reasons that I'll come to immediately for you on your second point, will always have a very limited political capital to spend, if at all, right? And transformation requires a very heavy political lifting. So I think we will basically be setting up these institutions for failure if they task them with transformative goals, at least without strong support of political representatives. So there may be some world in which the politicians do the heavy lifting and then the guarantor can do the tweaks or the implementation or whatever, right? But I think expecting them to change social orders is just setting them up for failure. So there's a good reason, I think, underpinning, a conceptual reason underpinning why it would probably be a bad idea to expect them to do. And, many constitutions have equality commissions or women's commissions and so on, right? And it's not a surprise that often those are the weakest of the guarantor institutions, right? Or they're often paper tigers, in part because they can't do any heavy lifting on the political front. Okay, finally, to electoral legitimacy, right? So I think I could not agree more strongly with the claim that electoral legitimacy in democracy is not the sole basis of institutional legitimacy. And it's a crisis of our times that we're increasingly believing that to be the case, and I think that has to be strongly resisted. But what are the alternatives, right? So and this is some disjointed thoughts inspired by your paper. First, you mentioned TN session, right? I just don't think, A, that charismatic legitimacy for these institutions is always going to be available. Sometimes there will be boring people being the leaders, and that may not be a bad thing. Often it's the charismatic ones who do a lot of damage both to the institution and to the body politic, right? So I'm not sure about charisma as an alternative. So the search for legitimacy has to look elsewhere. It will not be democracy. It also cannot be technocracy, right? So I don't think these institutions are court-like in that, they're not insulated from politics like courts are, and they should not be. They don't act in terms, at least performatively, acting on reasoned technical judgments based on law and justice and whatever, right? I think these institutions do have discretion, do have political nous. They do have to decide when is a good time to intervene, when they should hold back, not just for legal reasons, right? Often for political reasons, for institutional, for the norm in question. So all of that means that their legitimacy cannot be defended either on the grounds of the judicial legitimacy or on the grounds of political legitimacy. And this is also the reason for their fragility, right? That they sit in between law and politics in some ways. And I think that the only solution to the legitimacy question it has to, and this goes back to my first point about why to call them guarantor institutions, has to piggyback on the legitimacy of the norm they are defending. An electoral commission that effectively guarantees free and fair democracy is legitimate if and only to the extent that it actually guarantees free and fair elections, right? So I think that we cannot understand the legitimacy of these institutions without thinking about the legitimacy of the background fragile constitutional norm that they're defending. And that is why I think it's also extremely important that we think about these institutions in relation to the norm that their function is to protect. The final point I'll make is about politics and parties, right? So can I just hold up my hand and say not guilty to your charge about partisanship and politics and guarantor institutions? So I've again sent a link here on my work on political parties. And just to say that I think, well, let me start with this, right? I don't think political is the same as partisan. There's, in my mind, there's a huge gap between partisanship that is acting on behalf of a political party, usually the ruling party, and being political. I think these bodies are political, and rightly so. I mean, you can think of it as what Ron Herschel calls meta-politics, or sort of, constitutional politics, right? But they're not partisan, and it will be inappropriate if they act on a partisan basis, especially in favor of the ruling party. And what that distinction means for me is thinking about both their independence and their accountability in terms of the importance of opposition parties, right? That the only way to preserve their political but non-partisan character is to ensure something like, Sri Lankan Constitutional Council, where both the appointment and the accountability is subject to politicians, but not to the ruling party, right? Politicians in a balanced partisan committee where the ruling party and the opposition has an equal weight, an equal say, and therefore they respond to the entire swathe of political establishment and are controlled by the entire swathe of political establishment, but not just by the ruling party. And this is also why they are essentially distinct from technocrats, because technocrats I think are subject legitimately to the policy directives of the ruling party enacted through statutes, whereas these guys are different because they're constitutional. Okay, so I think I've made all my key points. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think I can stop there happily. Thank you.
It's fantastic. And I'm gonna hand over to Ming-Sung.
Thanks, David and Mara, for inviting me to pay close attention to this fantastic paper. And yeah, just like just to echo what Tarun said, I don't want to belabor on the point of the implications of the label. Because Fourth Branch would implicate the separation of powers involved another institutional player. But I think I wanted to focus on it's not just the Fourth Branch or Fourth Branch institutions. Regardless of the label we apply to the extra tripartite separation of powers constitutional organs. So I think by so the way I read Mike's paper, you attach the label constitutionalism to the discussion of a fourth branch. I think, and you identify three features: empowering institutions, mix of government's negative duty and the positive obligation, and the non-election-based legitimacy. I think in this way, I'm not sure whether you intend to present a fourth branch constitutionalism as a way to intervene to cut across the ongoing debates in the existing literature on constitutionalism. For example, the rights versus institution distinction in constitutional design, the negative versus positive concepts of constitutional government, and of course, the liberal versus transformative constitutionalism. So that's the first point I make of the paper after reading it. And so for the rest, I think I will confine my comment to how fourth branch constitutionalism is identified. And I think this brings up what lies at the core of a fourth branch constitutionalism, i.e., what is the fourth branch and what are the fourth branch institutions? So to begin with the first question, what is the fourth branch? Well, but I just I'm just applying the term used by the author without taking position on whether it should be confined to non-defending or other further institutions. So I think what is the fourth branch? To answer this question, to me, there are two possible ways. One way to define the fourth branch and to theorize it is to theorize it as a constitutional phenomenon is through an empirical survey of constitutions around the world and see what the constitutional organs or institutions that the different constitutions have provided for alongside the three classical branches of power. And of course, I think these institutions outside of the three traditional powers must be recognized as independent or autonomous in the Constitution itself. I think the independence is the defining feature of the fourth branch institutions or the guarantor institution. Then we can try to theorize the fourth branch by extracting the common features of such institutions as seen in positive constitutional documents. Alternatively, we can consider what the functions currently exercised by the three branches should be placed in the hands of a separate institution recognized on the constitutional level. And this suggests, if in the second way, then it suggests that the current examples of fourth branch institutions in comparative constitutions may be just a partial or transitional representation of what the fourth branch stands for in constitutional thinking. For example, if we take non-defending as the main function, the major purpose of having something outside the three constitutional powers, then we may think beyond the Ombudsman, Human Rights Commission, etc. So that, and so reading paper, I may be wrong. My impression is Mike's approach seems to come closer to the first one through an empirical survey, and here, so it raises so state institutions are named in the South African Constitution, Chapter 9. Tarun has pointed out, well, actually, it's like a miscellaneous collection of different institutions, each of which is granted independent status. But so it includes the Auditor General, the Public Protector, Broadcasting Authority, different commissions, including the Electoral Commission. But let's stay on the South African Constitution. If we look beyond Chapter 9, then in Chapter 13 about finance, there are two more constitutional bodies recognized there as an independent organ: Financial and the Fiscal Commission, and the Central Bank, the South African Reserve Bank. So if we take all of the, let's just stay on the South African Constitution one more time. Let's take all the institutions together. I can see a clear distinction between Chapter 9 and Chapter 13 institutions. So, and Chapter 9 institution, in terms of function and purpose, Chapter 9 institutions are intended to support democracy as designated in the Chapter 9 title, state institutions to support democracy. But the two financial bodies under Chapter 13, I would say, they are more tethered to the pursuit of good finance governance. So here we can find, in terms of function and purpose, there is at least there is a distinction between governance or regulation and democracy supporting. Right? And but when we take a deeper look at the institutions under Chapter 9, we can further I would say a further distinction can be drawn between the institution enabling the legitimacy of electoral democracy, the Electoral Commission, and those tasked to sustain the cultural and the political infrastructure of a democracy: Auditor General, Public Protector, Human Rights Commission, and Gender Equality Commission, etc. And so in my view, taken as a whole, independent institutions of the fourth branch can be classified into three types, perhaps: legitimating and sustaining, legitimating electoral democracy, sustaining democracy, and the governing itself, or regulatory. And so with the three functions of the fourth branch institutions set apart, I would say governance or regulation focused the fourth branch institutions, as opposed to may be more in line with transformative constitutionalism. It depends on the values or state goals enshrined in the Constitution itself. So I'm not sure whether this is a good example, but something like a Fair Housing Board in the U.S. Well, it may be it's intended to be transformative in the civil rights era, in matters of housing. And so now I want, so this is about how, so I think the point I want to draw out from Mike's paper is the function and the purpose when we discuss what constitutes fourth branch institutions. And now I want to focus on two institutional features, and I think Tarun has already noted this. So it's about independence and the non-partisanship. So, and And I will simply, comment on this part by way of asking questions. So first, I would say, why independence? Why independence? Or to put it differently, is it an intrinsic or instrumental value? I suspect the independence is an intrinsic value in the case of the Electoral Commission, as its mission is to hold fair and free elections. And I don't think by election, I suppose there will be opposing forces taking part. And so, in this sense, independence is I would say, is intrinsic. But I'm not so sure about other cases. I'm not saying that the independence of other cases can be taken away lightly. My point is that, well, if they are instrumental to some higher goal than the institution itself, then independence in other cases should be considered part of institutional design, and in light of the purpose to achieve and the function attached to such institutions. Second, what do we mean by independence? Of what is a fourth branch institution expected to be independent? Of the political branch, of all parties, or of politics, intra-government and extra-government forces, including pressure groups of various kinds. And this, again, I think this needs to be considered in light of the purpose and the function of the specific fourth branch institutions and the broader context. And will the distinction between presidentialism and the parliamentarism make any difference in this regard? And this brings up the second question, nonpartisanship. So again, what Tarun has already mentioned this. What is the relationship between nonpartisanship and independence? Do we expect the fourth branch institutions to steer clear of all politics or parties? Or we simply mean that such institutions should not be dominated by a single party? I think clarifying the institutional implications of independence and nonpartisanship should help us appreciate the full potential of the fourth branch to intergovernmental power dynamics and the state society relationship. But final thought on non-electoral legitimacy. So apart from expertise, I think you mentioned this, but I don't think expertise is just to illustrate the non-electoral character of legitimacy of fourth branch institutions. But can representativeness be another source of non-electoral legitimacy? How to balance expertise and representativeness in a collegial fourth branch institution? And I'm not sure whether we take all the state institutions named in South African Constitution, Chapter 9, as proper examples of fourth branch institutions. If so, then we will have some unitary fourth branch institution. And so, for example, public protector, auditor general, and in those cases, to what can the legitimacy of a unitary fourth branch institution be attributed? Personal integrity or charisma? Yeah, I think I stop here.
Thank you so much, Ming-Sung. Terrific response. Can I hand over to Mike if he wants to respond to Tarun and Ming-Sung?
Sure. How long do I have?
We'll give you 5 minutes.
Thanks to both Ming-Sung and Tarun. Really rich set of comments. I very much appreciate it. You've done a close reading of the paper. I can't possibly do justice to all of it, so I'll try to address a few of the main kind of comments and and questions. I'll start with Tarun. So I'm glad you agree with me on the point on positive constitutionalism. But it's still not the orthodox view that's written about every day. So there's still some, like, I'm glad you agree. I'm glad you think it's obvious. I think it's not obvious to all our colleagues. And then on the same way, Ming-Sung, you asked me, what am I trying to say about the debates on constitutionalism? Really, I'm just trying to take what I think is the kind of consensus view, say there's this critique. I think the critique has a lot of merit. So I'm not trying to primarily contribute to constitutionalism. I'm trying to build on some of the scholarship that's there and then use it in service of the other arguments on the fourth branch. So I have modest goals on constitutionalism, just building in that positive dimension, just being the main one. So, and you both pushed me to go back to some of this first generation debate about the fourth branch, which is very which I take to heart, that some of that's not in the paper. I do share the functional approach, Tarun. I think so. Why does that mean I don't use the guarantor? Right. I think mainly what the fourth branch institutions are doing is responding to systemic or predictable failures of the traditional three branches, mainly the political branches, but sometimes also the courts. And so to say they're defending an abstract general norm is sometimes just a bit remote from how it's actually been brought about in systems. I think in some instances it's more persuasive than others. And I do like the idea of branches because it signals the intent of constitutional designers to try to elevate what are sometimes just seen as purely bureaucratic or administrative bodies. And I think sometimes I hear there's no constitutional element to this. It's just regular bureaucratic bodies. We've always had them, right? And so something did change, though, in the dynamics of the constitutional systems, whatever the nuances. And so there's a new kind of player or set of players in the separation of powers game between the branches, to use John Farragon's term, and that shapes the constitutional order in a bunch of ways that we would normally associate with branches. So that's I take your points and probably need to clarify things more in the paper, but that's why I've sort of stuck with the idea of four branches. On legitimacy was your next question. If it's not electoral legitimacy, what is it? Which I think also Ming-Sung picked up on. Maybe it's expertise. Maybe it's competence. I take the point about representativeness. Some of the Latin American commissions really try to replicate all the other branches of the state, and they have very elaborate procedures and do take seriously representativeness. In the paper, I'm trying not to get pinned down on what I think what non-electoral legitimacy's one kind of defining feature is, apart from not being electoral. So you both appropriately picked up on that. So probably need to elaborate on that more in the next version of the paper. Tarun, your next question was on transformative constitutionalism. I agree with you. I'm not trying to say conceptually. I agree. Conceptually, there could be transformation. It is hard, though, because of the point that you made, which is absolutely correct, which is that you have non-electoral legitimacy, it's harder to be transformative unless you're seen as very closely working with the political system, which sort of at odds with the idea of independence. So it's a historical, not a conceptual claim. Last question, or last one that I have time to address at least, was on politics versus partisanship and non-partisanship from Tarun's set of comments. So obviously the work that fourth branch bodies do is inherently political. Okay, so that's for sure the case. I do worry about literature you're very familiar with and written it right, partisan lockups and parties monopolizing the process or having a duopoly. And so partisan balance is one approach, just have an election commission with equal number. But what about the small parties? If it's only the big parties represented, what about the public? Okay, so I have just that kind of concern. I think very much coming out of cases of civil war and actual violent conflict, achieving balance is often a way to get buy-in. Okay, so I have no critique of that, and you see that in lots of instances. But it's, to me, it's kind of a second order solution. Just to go back to Ming-Sung's point on how are the branches identified. Okay, I view this independence and filling the gaps of the other branches kind of together. So I think of that as a whole. Very helpful point on legitimating, sustaining, governing functions. I'll have to think about that a bit more, but you've encouraged me to try to break down what the transformative aspect would be in terms of their function. That's very helpful. So I think I'll leave it there just so we get to the questions, but I really appreciate all the comments.
Thank you so much, Mike, for
Mara.
your response.
So
Yeah,
is
Tarun?
it a moment to just say something about Ming-Sung's comments to add to the
Yes, of
to
course,
Mike's
definitely.
engagement? Because, well, I was troubled. Now, this is a different debate in constitutionalism, right? About thick and thin and whether constitutionalism has to be liberal and democratic, right? I want to resist an implicit suggestion in Ming-Sung's comments that guarantors can only serve liberal democracy. So I think they can serve any constitutional. And I would include the Iranian Council of Guardians as a guarantor institution. I think one of the failures of socialist constitutionalism is to do vanguardism of the party and not think about guarantors for socialism. So anyway, so that's the first point, that they can serve many masters. And I think your governance feature, Ming-Sung, again, makes me worried for the same reason that the transformative idea makes me worried, right? I don't think these institutions have the political capital to carry the weight of governance. Their capacity has been, their function has been much more limited than abroad. They're not plenary bodies in the way that, and this is the point I'm making about norms, right? They serve one single norm or an aspect thereof, but they're not plenary bodies. They don't pick and choose whatever they want to do and things like that generally.
Thanks so much, Tarun. I have a question from the room.
Can everybody hear me when I'm speaking? And I don't know about this.
It's the first time we use it, so we're gonna try.
Okay, my name is Ralph Rogowski. I'm now an emeritus professor here at Warwick, and I've done some work on comparative constitutional courts. But my question is really picking up on one of Ming-Sung's point, if I understood what you were aiming at, which is broadening the idea of the fourth branch. If we go beyond the empirical assessment, can we think about it broader? And I was triggered to ask a question because when I came here, I was thinking about something totally different what I heard. Because there's a discussion about the fourth branch. I'm from Germany originally. That focused on something different, what you were talking about. That focuses actually on the public media. So my question is a question coming from sort of a Habermasian perspective of a public sphere and a critical public sphere that is the sounding board for politics. And of course, in complete terms, this is a debate about support for public broadcasting and the need for, and if you want, fact-based independent discussion. As part of a constitutional requirement. So Habermas would say it is necessary, and his concept of the constitution, this critical public sphere is what is needed for functioning democracy, and there needs to be public protection for that. Now, if you think about the fourth branch in the broader terms, that would be an element of, actually there's a non-legal political discussion of a fourth branch, which is actually that. Now, what I'm talking about, the fourth branch is the media, the critical media commenting on the politics.
Mike?
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the question and the prompt to think more about Habermas. Many constitutions protect sort of media, telecommunications commissions or media fairness commissions. There's of course public broadcasters. So fourth estate, I do get your point. That is, there's some resonance with the concept of the fourth branch, and I know Tarun has echoed it in the chat there. So I understand that as those as separate things, but the media and the need to protect sort of the public sphere in terms of public broadcasting and broadcasting affairs, sometimes that's been part of constitutional design of the fourth branch. Hard to be Habermasian optimist about the public sphere these days. I find myself being a little more skeptical of how we might achieve that, but I think the fourth branch does sometimes intersect quite directly with this idea of media fairness through the creation of these sort of regulatory or oversight bodies, less so in terms of actually creating the institutions that would provide content.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to field the questions from the online participants.
Okay, so we have a question online, hopefully. So the first question is, well, thank you for your presentation. They say, I'm wondering if, in your view, it is always necessary for fourth branch constitutional entities to emerge from a written, entrenched constitution. They say that is the case in some of the global south jurisdictions you've mentioned, but it's also possible for the fourth branch to emanate from an affirmative legislative choice to establish a quote-unquote quasi-constitutional body, one that becomes distinctive from the executive branch and takes on a constitutional life of its own. They say, they question that. They say, what I have in mind are things like privacy commissions or human rights commissions in Canada, whose independence is not constitutionally guaranteed, but who are often seen as implementing quasi-constitutional legislation that the legislature has chosen to give precedence over ordinary legislation in cases of conflict. Perhaps entities such as these also gain independence through a political choice rather than constitutional entrenchment. To some extent, they seem continuous with the executive, but they also seem distinctive from them in certain respects. Okay, that's a very helpful question. I do agree you could have a statutorily created independent body that functionally operates like a fourth branch body. I mean, I'm based in Canada. Elections Canada is like that, especially privacy commissions, Bank of Canada. So I'm with you on that. Most written constitutions, though, if you have a written constitution, you do try to entrench the bodies because it gives them, it doesn't insulate them indefinitely or against all political forces, but it provides another layer. So the Canadian Charter is not that old, you know, it's 1982, but it's a little bit out of date of contemporary constitutional design practices. Just simply says every citizen has the right to vote, for example, doesn't say right to be registered as a voter, right to have a political party, right to free and fair elections, right to have an election commission, right? So things that are in most new constitutions or significantly amended constitutions, they give a lot more detail on democratic rights, including institutional structures to protect them. So you could absolutely be a statutory body that kind of rises up. It's just not the standard kind of case around the globe. Most countries, of course, we're in the UK. Most countries do have a written constitution that deliberately seeks to entrench. So I was just trying to address kind of the broader set of cases, but I don't disagree with your point. Okay. And then we have another question. So the question is, they say, in Suriname, we have a constitutional court, which is not considered part, says, I'm assuming, of judicial branch of government. According to the law, it is a state institute. It is also not completely independent of the government. The president picks the members for a term of 5 years. It misses the non-electoral legitimacy. I guess there's not really a question there, but I guess I don't know if there's anything that you want to state with respect to that.
I've given lots of presentations on the fourth branch over the years. One of the best parts is learning about new things. I'm not familiar with that, with the institution in Suriname, but a good prompt to go and learn more about it. So I appreciate that.
And making note of it. There's a question, I think, directed more towards Tarun. I'm happy to. So the question says that they are requesting that Tarun please mention about the work on meta-guarantor in the Sri Lankan constitution.
Sure, it's basically Sri Lanka, Nepal, and I think Seychelles and a few other countries have a constitutional council, which is a permanent body with ex officio members, including the Prime Minister and Leader of Opposition. It can have other members of the ruling party, but usually balanced out with members of opposition parties, not necessarily the main opposition party. There are many permutations and combinations. Sri Lanka, for example, also has 3 civil society members. And obviously, there's a problem of how, individuals are easier to capture than institutions and so on. But anyway, the point of these constitutional councils is to make all the appointments to all the constitutional guarantors and the senior judiciary. And the idea is that by doing that, you secure their independence. So I will post a link to Dinesha's work in the chat if anybody is interested in looking it up further.
We don't have any more questions online. If anybody wants to add, but right now there's nothing.
Well, if there is nothing in the room, I did want to add something to the. Oh, is there something in the room? Otherwise, I can say something on the media question.
We have from Sonia, and then I'll come back to you, Tarun, if that's okay. Sonia.
Yeah, I was just interested in the question of legitimacy again, non-electoral legitimacy, which was mentioned by Tarun. So if I understood Tarun correctly, he was saying that in the case of non-electoral legitimacy for four-branch institutions, we could only justify their legitimacy if we think of the constitutional norms that they're defending and that are in the background. But I don't think you in your presentation at least said anything about the grounds that you see as justifying this non-electoral legitimacy. So if you agree with Tarun's view, or you think about other possible bases that justify this non-electoral legitimacy?
Yeah, that's a very good question, pointing to a gap in the paper that I was deliberately trying not to be pinned down on a specific feature of non-electoral legitimacy. I'd probably tie it to expertise or competence. I guess part of the but it's an interesting point from both of you. I do this is part of the challenge, right? Is say you take like Ron Herschel's critique of constitutional courts as independent bodies, or at least his account, right? That sometimes what's happening is not new institution, constitutional court put in place to protect for the grand goal of protecting rights. Actually, what you have is hegemonic preservation, locking in certain values or at least certain power structures, right? So he doesn't make this specific argument, so I don't want to put words in his mouth unfairly, but you could extend that argument, right? You could say some of these fourth branch bodies are actually about locking in a certain policy consensus, or a certain set of values or structures that does work with one particular group of elites. And so it's just a complex question about whether there is a norm that is actually being protected or guaranteed. Is it simply a very granular, particular response to systemic institutional failings? Is it a strategic choice made by elites to try to take something off the democratic agenda for maybe perhaps some unsavory kind of reasons, right? So abusive constitutional type of reasons. So that's in trying to think through more about that kind of set of issues. That's why I haven't tried to that's why I don't have an answer in the paper on the specific form of non-electoral legitimacy. I'm just trying to work through how we can do justice to those kind of empirical realities or different kinds of intent behind the fourth branch.
Thanks so much, Mike. Let me get back to Tarun.
Thanks very much, Mara. So just on the media thing, I think every time I talk about this, somebody will ask about the media because especially, I don't know how it's translated in European languages, but in English, because of the French tradition, the media is called the fourth estate. And that confusion between fourth branch and fourth estate happens all the time. And obviously, that's not what we are talking about here. But the confusion becomes greater because broadcasting and media.
It's the same as it's called vierte Gewalt. So it's the same as the other thing. So it's a fourth exactly Gewalt. Yeah. So in Germany, it would be the fourth Gewalt. Yeah.
Okay, that's the estates idea comes from the idea of different social groups, right? Different societal, so the nobility, the clergy, the people, and then you have the fourth estate, the media, right? Whereas the branches are much more statist rather than societal in their origin. So we think of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches as branches of the state. And I think at least the literature thinks of the fourth branch institutions as state institutions. But media regulators can definitely be part of that. And actually, the Chapter 9 of South African Constitution does include the Broadcasting Commission in the final section, unknowingly does not list it in the opening section of Chapter 9 as one of the institutions covered. And obviously it's a typo because somebody put it in at the last minute and they didn't realize they needed to update the introductory section. And the final point on the last question on legitimacy, I don't know. I mean, I think most of us in our ordinary lives are value pluralists, right? We don't think that just because honesty is a good thing, that we should not care about kindness, or that, pacifism is a good thing and therefore we should not care about, diligence. So I don't know why it is that when we turn to state institutions, we suddenly become value monists and think that there must be one thing that has to legitimize and justify everything. And, which is why I think, it's the value of the norm in question that is enough for the legitimacy of an institution that actually is able to defend that norm. So if it is probity, if probity is a good thing, then an institution that is effective at protecting probity is a good thing. And if theocracy is a bad thing, then an institution protecting theocracy is illegitimate because theocracy is a bad thing, right? So I'm not sure that we need to find a one single legitimacy ground for all the institutions. I think democracy is a good thing, but so are many others.
Thank you so much, Tarun. David, do we have any more questions online? Then I might abuse my position as chair. And you talk in the paper about Nepal as one of the case studies. There were also references in Tarun's response to the case study of Nepal. So I was curious whether you would consider not just the various commissions, the other commissions in the 2015 constitutions as obviously fourth branch institutions. But you also talked about, and I think that was in Tarun's comments, about the Constitutional Council and the Judicial Council. But what you see under the 2015 constitution is that actually both institutions have a majority of ex officio representatives from the executive. And when we're looking at the Judicial Council under the 2015 Constitution, in major divergence from constitutional practice as well, members from the judiciaries are actually in a minority in the Judicial Council. So in my book manuscript, I'm talking about the Constitutional Council and the Judicial Council as constitutional bodies rather than fourth branch institutions. So I was wondering, and I guess that's also for Tarun, if he wants to chime in, how do you see that? Do you see that as a distinction or not with respect to the case study, giving you some more empirical material?
No, that's very helpful. Obviously, you're the expert on Nepal. It's been one of the cases that has been quite important because the reforms are recent, and also A lot of discussion, obviously, of South Asia, right, and Indian influence, Sri Lankan influence, and the innovations that have happened, and it's quite innovative. I think using the term constitutional body lets you avoid some of these definitional questions that we've gotten into. So I wouldn't necessarily, if that's not what you want to discuss in the manuscript, you might be prefer to stick with constitutional bodies. There could be, though, in theory, right, there could be some institutions that don't quite have the same status, right? They're not, that's why, and again, to go back to the idea of a branch, right, is this simply a new public body, or is it intended to be elevated to have some kind of equivalence? So, I think the Judicial Council does not have that equivalence. If I'm remembering the details properly, maybe you're gonna correct me on that. But I think there could be a distinction between constitutional bodies and fourth branch bodies.
Thank you so much. Tarun, would you like to chime in?
Yes, please, Mara. So one of the people you want to look at is David Kosar's work on judicial councils as guarantor institutions or fourth branch institutions. But so I think there are three different issues here, right? One is a conceptual question, one is a thick normative question, or the thin normative question, right? So the conceptual question is what qualifies as a fourth branch body or a guarantor body, right? And that I don't think Mike and I disagree very much on. These are constitutionalized bodies. They can be entrenched legally or politically. In response to one of the questions, they serve to protect fragile norms fragile because the other branches are bad at protecting them, and they're themselves constitutionally entrenched. Right? They are normatively, you can judge them as good or bad, based on whether they serve a good constitutional norm or a bad constitutional norm. And that obviously requires a separate moral argument. But I think the question you're asking with Nepal is normativity in the thin sense, right? Which is, are they fit for purpose, right? So just as we can ask, whether a knife is a good knife or a bad knife in the thick sense, or whether it cuts people or vegetables, and in the thin sense of whether it's safe to handle, whether it's a sharp blade and all of that, right? So in the thin sense, you can have a guarantor institution or a fourth branch body, which is just badly designed, right? Just as, you can design an executive badly, like presidentialism is a terrible design for the executive, I think. So you can have a bad guarantor badly designed guarantor institution, and giving the ruling party a majority on a guarantor institution seems to me to be a terrible design formula, right? It's just you're setting it up to fail. So so that is how I would think of it, as the conceptual question, the thick normative question, and the thin normative question.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think we're slightly over time, and it is with great pleasure that I would like to thank all our speakers, everyone for attending, and I hand over to David for some final housekeeping and future announcements.
Yeah, as always, we'd like to thank everyone in our audience for attending this event, and to our wonderful speakers today. Just a note, just so that people are aware, and we have a new visitor on screen, we see. Just to note that, as always, a recording of the seminar, assuming our new technology works, will be uploaded to the Center's YouTube page in due course. And then just one final thing before ending today's event, just to highlight that we have another great event that's coming up in 2 weeks' time. It's a roundtable discussion on contextual approaches to constitutional law in academic publishing. So we have editorial representatives from 6 leading comparative constitutional law journals, with the discussion moderated by Professor Tom Ginsberg from the University of Chicago. So for more information about all our events, including that one, please check out our webpage or social media pages. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And as always, enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the questions, and thanks, Tarun. Thanks, Ming-Sung.